From the outside, the Soviet Union of the late 1970s still looked like an unshakable giant. A nuclear superpower stretching across 11 time zones, armed with missiles, ideology, and the confidence of a nation that believed history itself was on its side. But beneath the concrete, the rebar was already rusting. And one of the most lethal cracks in the Soviet foundation came from a place no tank, no missile, and no secret police could defend against: the global price of oil. In the 1970s, the USSR survived, and in many ways thrived, because of high oil prices. When the Arab oil embargo sent shockwaves across the Western world in 1973, the Soviets quietly celebrated. Every surge in the price of crude meant more hard currency flowing into Moscow's nearly empty vaults. Oil became the lifeline that kept the Soviet command economy breathing. Nearly 60% of the USSR's foreign currency came from exporting oil and gas. Those dollars and Deutschmarks were used to buy grain, industrial equipment, and technology the Soviet system could not produce on its own. As long as oil stayed expensive, the Soviet Union looked stronger than it truly was. But the United States understood a dangerous truth. If oil held up the Soviet Empire, then oil could also bring it down. Washington had spent decades cultivating a special relationship with Saudi Arabia, the world's most influential oil producer. In 1974, the U.S. guaranteed military protection for the Saudi monarchy, and in return, Saudi oil was priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. This agreement didn't just cement the petrodollar system, it gave America indirect leverage over the global price of oil. And in the mid-1980s, the U.S. finally used that leverage. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan persuaded Saudi Arabia to flood the world market with cheap oil. Overnight, the kingdom ramped up production to levels no one thought possible. The result was catastrophic for Moscow. Within a single year, oil prices collapsed from $32 a barrel to just $10. For ordinary consumers around the world, it was a blessing. For the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of the end. Almost half of the Soviet state budget evaporated. Foreign reserves cratered. The government no longer had the hard currency to import food, something it already relied on heavily due to decades of disastrous agricultural policy. The Soviet Union, a country with more land than any empire in history, could build nuclear submarines, but could not feed its own people. And now, with oil revenues gone, the shortages became impossible to hide. Bread lines stretched across city blocks, meat vanished from shelves, butter and sugar were rationed. In many regions, potatoes became the only reliable source of calories. A superpower was starving. This economic shock didn't just empty stores, it emptied the Soviet soul. People who once believed in the destiny of the communist project now saw only decline. Factories slowed, wages stagnated, faith in the party eroded, and just as the country's confidence reached its lowest point, another disaster struck. One that didn't merely expose weakness, but incinerated whatever trust remained. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The blast released a radioactive cloud more than 400 times stronger than Hiroshima, drifting silently over Ukraine, Belarus, and the western USSR. But the shock was not just nuclear, it was political. The Soviet leadership tried to hide everything. They allowed May Day parades to proceed under radioactive dust. They made no announcement, no warning, no evacuation until people began collapsing from acute poisoning. For 18 days, the government maintained the lie. And when Gorbachev finally addressed the nation on television, he focused not on the victims, not on transparency, not on responsibility, but on attacking the West for malicious lies and exaggerations. Under the new policy of glasnost, meant to increase openness, citizens soon discovered the truth, not only about Chernobyl, but about decades of corruption, mismanagement, and decay. Glasnost was intended to save the system. Instead, it stripped away the illusions that had preserved it. Yet even glasnost was only one piece of the puzzle. The Soviet economy had already been crumbling for years. The war in Afghanistan drained lives and rubles with no victory in sight. Industrial output stagnated, the planned economy sputtered, and Gorbachev's second major reform, perestroika, was meant to fix the economy by introducing elements of market freedom. But it came too late. Perestroika weakened the old command system before anything strong enough could replace it. Factories suddenly had more autonomy, but no resources. Prices began to shift, but wages did not. The Communist Party still demanded loyalty, but offered little in return. Citizens sensed weakness, and weakness invited defiance. By the late 1980s, Moscow's power over Eastern Europe was collapsing. The Soviet military, once feared, was now underfunded and demoralized. Gorbachev reduced troop presence across the Warsaw Pact, hoping to improve relations with the West. Instead, he accidentally signaled that the Soviet grip had loosened. Poland rebelled. Hungary opened its borders. Czechoslovakia revolted. Romania executed its dictator. East Germans tore down the Berlin Wall. The empire cracked from the outside in. The economy collapsed from the inside out. And, standing at the center, was a leader trying desperately to reform a system that no longer had the strength to be saved. It was a sequence of blows: cheap oil, food shortages, Chernobyl, glasnost, perestroika, rebellion across Eastern Europe, all converging into a crisis no superpower could survive. As the Soviet Union staggered through the late 1980s, the cracks in its foundation widened into fractures no amount of propaganda could hide. And those fractures began not in Moscow, but in the far edges of the empire, places that had lived under Soviet control for nearly half a century and now sensed that the giant was finally weak enough to challenge. The first tremors came from Poland. After years of economic misery, workers formed the Solidarity movement, demanding rights the Kremlin had always refused to grant. Under a different Soviet leader, tanks might have rolled in, just as they had in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. But Gorbachev refused to use force. His doctrine was simple, and for Moscow, fatal. No more invasions to save communism. Eastern Europe listened carefully and heard permission to rise. Hungary quietly opened its border with Austria. It was the first crack in the Iron Curtain. East Germans noticed. Thousands fled through Hungary into the west, overwhelming Vienna and Berlin. In Leipzig, protests grew from hundreds to tens of thousands, then to hundreds of thousands. The East German regime panicked, then hesitated, then collapsed under the weight of its own confusion. And on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, once the most terrifying symbol of division in the modern world, fell not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic misunderstanding and a wave of humanity that no government could stop. People danced, embraced, climbed the wall that had separated families for decades. But in Moscow, the mood was not celebratory. The Politburo watched their empire disintegrate on live television. If East Germany could fall, then so could everything else. And it did. Czechoslovakia erupted in the Velvet Revolution, a peaceful uprising that toppled one of the staunchest communist governments. Romania's collapse was far bloodier. Protesters clashed with security forces, and Nicolae Ceausescu, once one of the most feared dictators in Europe, was executed alongside his wife on live television after a trial that lasted less than an hour. Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Baltic states all moved with astonishing speed to break from Moscow's orbit. It was a geopolitical earthquake, and at its center was a Soviet Union that could no longer disguise its paralysis. Inside the USSR, the consequences of glasnost were becoming uncontrollable. Newspapers exposed corruption that had been buried for decades. Citizens questioned everything: statistics, leaders, promises, the very legitimacy of the Communist Party. Ethnic tensions, long suppressed, resurfaced violently. Armenia and Azerbaijan clashed over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Baltic republics declared independence. Ukraine began demanding sovereignty. Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova all felt the pull of self-determination. The Soviet Union, once glued together by fear and force, had traded oppression for openness. And the moment the people tasted that freedom, the old bonds snapped. Meanwhile, the economy continued its freefall. Stores were empty, inflation soared, factories produced goods no one wanted and lacked materials for the goods people did need. Farmers had no incentives to grow food. Workers had no incentives to work. The ruble collapsed in value. The black market became more real than the official one. In Moscow, lines for basic necessities stretched for hours. In Leningrad, pensioners fainted from hunger. In Ukraine, miners went on strike, shutting down coal production. Mothers rationed bread so their children could eat. The Soviet system, once presented as the future of humanity, could barely keep its people alive. Amid this chaos, another figure rose into the spotlight: Boris Yeltsin, loud, defiant, unpredictable, and, at least in the eyes of ordinary citizens, far more relatable than the polished, diplomatic Gorbachev. Yeltsin attacked the party elite, condemned corruption, and demanded radical change. While Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union, Yeltsin sought to abandon it entirely. Their rivalry split the country's leadership. The old guard hated both of them, Gorbachev for weakening the system, Yeltsin for trying to destroy it. But the people had made their choice. In 1991, Yeltsin became the first elected president of the Russian Republic, the largest and most powerful republic inside the Soviet Union. The stage was set for the final confrontation. In August 1991, hardline communists, panicked by the accelerating collapse of the Union, launched a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow, soldiers surrounded the government buildings, state television switched to classical music, Gorbachev was placed under house arrest in Crimea, and across the country citizens feared a return to Stalinist authoritarianism. But the coup plotters had made a fatal mistake. They underestimated Yeltsin. In a moment broadcast around the world, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank parked outside the Russian parliament and delivered a speech that electrified the nation. He called for mass resistance. He urged soldiers to defy illegal orders. He framed the coup not as a return to stability, but as an assault on freedom itself. And the people listened. Within 72 hours, the coup collapsed. Soldiers defected. Protesters surrounded tanks. The plotters were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But everything had changed. He was no longer the leader of a superpower. He was the captain of a sinking ship. The failed coup had shattered the last remnants of Soviet authority. The Communist Party, already unpopular, was suspended. Republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine voted overwhelmingly to leave the USSR. Belarus and Russia followed. The Union Treaty, Gorbachev's desperate attempt to preserve a loose federation, fell apart before his eyes. In December 1991, Yeltsin, along with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus, met secretly in a forest lodge and signed the Belovezha Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. They did not consult Gorbachev. They did not ask for permission. They simply dissolved the country he was still trying to lead. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on live television. His speech was calm, almost gentle, filled with reflections on hope and disappointment. And then, with a quiet finality, he announced his resignation as president of a country that no longer existed. At 7:32 p.m., the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the white-blue-red tricolor of the Russian Federation rose into the winter sky. For the first time since 1922, the world had no Soviet Union. The empire that had once defied Hitler, split the world in two, and threatened the United States with nuclear fire had vanished in silence. Not with a war, but with hunger, bankruptcy, rebellion, and the weight of its own contradictions. It had died the way great empires often do, not suddenly, but slowly, then all at once. In the days after the Soviet flag was lowered for the final time, millions of people across what had once been the largest country on Earth woke up to a world transformed. Borders had shifted, governments had vanished, economies had imploded, and for the first time in living memory, the fate of the region would no longer be determined by a single, monolithic authority in Moscow. The Soviet Union, a superpower that once dictated global affairs, had dissolved into 15 independent nations almost overnight. But the collapse of the USSR was not just a geopolitical event. It was the unraveling of an entire worldview. For decades, communism had promised a more just society, a future where equality replaced exploitation and where progress was the birthright of every citizen. Yet when the machinery of the state finally broke down, what remained were empty shelves, unpaid workers, and a generation raised on slogans that no longer meant anything. And in the silence that followed the collapse, the world began asking a question that continues to echo decades later. Why did the Soviet Union really fall? Some pointed to the oil collapse of the 1980s, the strategic partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia that drained the Soviet treasury and exposed how fragile the planned economy truly was. Others blamed Chernobyl, the catastrophe that didn't just irradiate the land, but poisoned the very trust between the government and its people. Still others highlighted glasnost, which unleashed decades of suppressed anger, or perestroika, which dismantled the command economy faster than any market could replace it. Yet no single explanation feels complete on its own. The truth is more complex, more intertwined, more tragic. The Soviet Union collapsed because its internal contradictions finally grew larger than the state that contained them. For decades, the USSR had balanced itself precariously between military ambition and economic stagnation. It built missiles faster than it built refrigerators. It prioritized geopolitical influence over food security. It poured unimaginable resources into competing with the United States while failing to give its own citizens a reason to believe. And when the global environment shifted, when oil prices plunged, when technology advanced, when information became impossible to contain, the Soviet system could no longer adapt. It did not have the flexibility of a market economy. It did not have the legitimacy of a democratic system, and it no longer had the fear-based authority of Stalin's era. Gorbachev attempted to modernize the system, but every reform he introduced made the contradictions sharper. Glasnost brought truth, but truth shattered illusions. Perestroika brought autonomy, but autonomy exposed incompetence. Reducing the military calmed the West, but emboldened Eastern Europe. Opening debate encouraged reformers, but also awakened nationalists and separatists who had been silent for a generation. Instead of correcting its course, the Soviet Union found itself accelerating toward disintegration. When the coup of August 1991 failed, it was not merely a political defeat for the hardliners. It was proof that the system's core had collapsed. A superpower whose identity was built on control could no longer control even its own capital. The coup was the last attempt to preserve the old order, and its failure signaled that the old order no longer existed. The republics moved quickly after that. Ukraine's referendum for independence passed with overwhelming support, including in regions that once identified strongly with Moscow. The Baltic states announced their freedom with defiant clarity. Georgia and Armenia broke away. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan all followed. In the end, the Soviet Union didn't crack apart. It dissolved from within like ice thawing under the spring sun. Yet even in its final days, many in the West misunderstood the true nature of the collapse. They assumed communism had been defeated because capitalism was superior. They believed they had witnessed the end of history, the triumph of one ideology over another. But the fall of the USSR was not merely an ideological failure. It was a structural failure, a systemic failure, a human failure. The Soviet model demanded absolute control from the center, yet governed a landmass too vast, too diverse, and too dynamic to be controlled indefinitely. It tried to build a modern industrial economy using tools designed for wartime mobilization. It tried to unite dozens of cultures, languages, and histories under a single narrative. And in the end, it became a victim of its own scale, its own rigidity, its own myths. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: empires rarely fall because of a single blow. They fall because 1,000 small fractures are ignored until one day the structure collapses under its own weight. Oil prices alone did not destroy the Soviet Union. Chernobyl alone did not destroy the Soviet Union. Glasnost, perestroika, Afghanistan, rebellion in Eastern Europe. None were fatal by themselves. But together they formed a chain reaction, economic, political, social, and psychological, that no government could survive. And when the end finally came, it was strangely quiet. No great war, no dramatic showdown, just a resignation speech, a lowered flag, and a bewildered population looking into an uncertain future. Today, decades later, the legacy of the Soviet collapse still shapes global politics. Borders that were drawn in 1991 remain points of tension. Economies that were uprooted still struggle with inequality. And a new Russia emerged from the ruins, more unpredictable, more volatile, and more deeply shaped by the trauma of losing an empire. The fall of the Soviet Union was not only the end of a superpower, it was the end of a world order built on fear, ambition, ideology, and the belief that two systems could divide the planet forever. When the USSR fell, the global balance of power shifted overnight. The Cold War ended not with victory, but with exhaustion, not with conquest, but with collapse. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson. No empire, no matter how powerful, can survive forever if it refuses to change in a world that changes constantly. The Soviet Union didn't simply lose a competition with the West. It lost the ability to evolve. And in the end, evolution, not ideology, is what determines the survival of nations.